Epimenides, a philosopher from Crete, is said to have made a simple but puzzling statement. All Cretans are liars. At first glance, this seems straightforward, but when examined closely, it creates a logical problem. If what he says is true, then all Cretans, including himself, must be liars. But if he is a liar, then his statement cannot be true. If his statement is false, then it must be the case that not all Cretans are liars, meaning at least some Cretans tell the truth. If even one Cretan tells the truth, then Epimenides' statement cannot be accurate. This contradiction forms the core of the paradox. To understand why this statement is troubling, consider a simpler version. Suppose someone says, "I always lie." If that statement is true, then they must always lie. But if they always lie, then their statement itself must be a lie, meaning they do not always lie. If their statement is false, then it must be the case that they sometimes tell the truth, which contradicts the idea that they always lie. The sentence is impossible to evaluate because it negates itself. Now, apply this reasoning back to Epimenides. If all Cretans are liars, then Epimenides, being a Cretan, must also be lying. But if he is lying, then his statement is not true, meaning not all Cretans are liars. If not all Cretans are liars, then there must be at least one Cretan who tells the truth. If such a person exists, then Epimenides' statement is false. But if his statement is false, then he himself must be telling a lie, which suggests that not all Cretans lie. This circular reasoning prevents a clear resolution. This paradox belongs to a class of logical problems known as self-referential paradoxes. A self-referential statement is one that applies to itself. "This sentence is false" is a classic example. If it is true, then it must be false. If it is false, then it must be true. These types of paradoxes challenge how language and logic function. They expose how contradictions arise when a statement talks about itself in a way that loops endlessly. A way to see this paradox in real life is through trust and deception. Imagine a town where everyone is known to be dishonest. You visit and ask someone, "Is everyone here a liar?" If they answer yes, then they must be lying, which means at least some people tell the truth. If they answer no, then it means at least some people tell the truth, which also contradicts the idea that everyone lies. There is no logical way to determine who is honest or dishonest, because any claim about the group's dishonesty negates itself. In practical terms, the paradox also highlights a problem in language. When someone makes an absolute statement, like "all politicians are corrupt," it can often be challenged by finding even one counterexample. If there is even one politician who is not corrupt, then the statement is false. This is why broad, sweeping statements often create logical issues. They leave no room for exceptions, making them vulnerable to contradiction. Another way to explore the paradox is through lying itself. A lie is a statement that contradicts reality. If a person always lies, then their statements should consistently be false. But if a person declares that they always lie, then that statement, if true, must also be false. In the case of Epimenides, he describes an entire group of people, including himself, as liars. The statement, by its own structure, collapses under its own logic. Historically, the Epimenides paradox has influenced logic and philosophy, particularly in discussions of truth and self-reference. Philosophers have explored ways to resolve it. One approach is to argue that statements about lying must be framed more carefully. Instead of saying, "all Cretans are liars," someone could say, "some Cretans lie frequently." This avoids the self-referential trap because it does not create a contradiction if some Cretans do tell the truth. Another approach is to separate different levels of language. If someone says, "I always lie," they may be speaking in a way that requires an external truth evaluation rather than an internal contradiction. In logic, this paradox has implications for systems that attempt to define truth within a closed structure. The 20th century mathematician Kurt Gödel explored a similar problem in his incompleteness theorems. He showed that in any system of mathematics, there will always be statements that cannot be proven true or false within that system. His proof relied on self-referential statements, similar to the liar paradox. If a logical system can describe itself, then contradictions can emerge that make it impossible to determine whether certain statements are true or false. This discovery had profound effects on mathematics, computer science, and philosophy. The paradox also has practical consequences in artificial intelligence and programming. If a computer is programmed to evaluate whether a statement is true or false, encountering a self-referential paradox could cause an infinite loop. If a system is designed to detect lies and is presented with the statement, "Everything I say is false," it may be unable to resolve whether the statement is a lie. This problem appears in computer science when dealing with undecidable problems, where no clear algorithm can determine an answer. A variation of this paradox occurs in ethics. If someone says, "You should never trust a liar," but they are a liar themselves, should they be trusted? If they are lying, then their statement must be false, which means that sometimes liars can be trusted. If their statement is true, then liars should never be trusted, including the speaker. This contradiction makes it difficult to establish absolute moral rules about honesty. The paradox is also seen in social interactions. If a person is known for deception, people may not believe anything they say. But if that person occasionally tells the truth, how can others distinguish between truth and lies? If a habitual liar suddenly makes a truthful statement, people may assume it is false. This leads to a breakdown in communication, where truth and lies become indistinguishable. A similar issue appears in politics and media. If a news source is accused of always spreading false information, then any true information they report might be dismissed. If a person says, "Everything this news channel reports is false," they create a paradox. If the channel reports a fact, such as water is wet, then that fact should be false according to the claim, which is impossible. This illustrates how extreme skepticism toward any source can lead to contradictions. One way people try to resolve the paradox is by distinguishing between partial and complete falsehoods. If Epimenides had said, "Many Cretans are liars," the contradiction would disappear because it allows for exceptions. However, his statement is absolute, leaving no room for any truth among Cretans. This absolute framing is what leads to the logical collapse. The paradox also raises the question of whether truth must always be absolute. Some philosophical perspectives suggest that truth exists in degrees. If someone is mostly honest but occasionally lies, then describing them as a liar might be misleading. Similarly, if someone generally lies but occasionally tells the truth, calling them a complete liar might also be inaccurate. This complicates how we think about truth and deception. The Epimenides paradox remains one of the simplest yet most effective demonstrations of how language, truth, and logic interact. It forces people to think carefully about how statements relate to themselves and how absolute claims can lead to contradictions. It appears in discussions of philosophy, mathematics, politics, and everyday life. It continues to challenge how people understand self-referential statements and the nature of truth. Moore's paradox presents a strange situation where a person makes a statement that is logically possible but psychologically puzzling. If someone says, "It is raining, but I don't believe it is raining," their words do not contradict each other in a strict logical sense. The weather can be one way, and belief can be another. Yet hearing someone say this feels odd. A person typically believes what they assert, and asserting something while denying belief in it creates a conflict in how people normally communicate. Imagine a person standing outside in the rain without an umbrella. They see water falling from the sky, feel it on their skin, and hear it hitting the pavement. Now suppose they say, "It is raining." This statement makes perfect sense. It aligns with their observations and their belief. But if they follow up with, "I don't believe it is raining," confusion arises. Why would someone state a fact while denying that they believe it? It sounds as if they are contradicting themselves, yet they technically are not. To understand the problem, consider how belief and assertion usually work together. When someone makes a statement, they imply that they believe what they are saying. If a person says, "I like coffee," listeners assume that the person truly likes coffee. If the same person says, "I like coffee, but I don't believe I like coffee," their words create confusion. The structure of the sentence does not violate logic, but it clashes with how humans expect beliefs and statements to align. This paradox becomes more interesting when applied to real-life situations. Imagine a student who takes an exam and confidently writes down an answer. They say, "The capital of France is Paris," but then add, I don't believe the capital of France is Paris. It is unclear what they mean. If they know the answer is Paris, why would they doubt their belief? If they truly do not believe it, why would they write it as their answer? The contradiction exists not in the facts themselves, but in the relationship between belief and expression. G.E. Moore, the philosopher who identified this paradox, pointed out that it reveals something fundamental about how people think and communicate. When a person asserts something, they usually believe it. If they deny belief in their own statement, it signals a breakdown in reasoning. This paradox highlights an important difference between knowledge and belief. Knowledge is typically considered justified true belief, while belief itself can exist without knowledge. A person might believe something that is false, or lack belief in something that is true. Consider a case where someone suffers from a delusion. A man might look at his reflection in a mirror and recognize his own face, yet he insists, "That is my reflection, but I don't believe it is my reflection." His perception and knowledge tell him one thing, but his belief does not match. This kind of disconnect is rare in everyday life, but can happen in cases of mental disorders or deep confusion. A person experiencing dissociation might say, "I am speaking right now, but I don't believe I am speaking," expressing a disconnect between experience and belief. Another example comes from situations where people act out of habit. A person might say, "I locked the door, but I don't believe I locked the door." They physically remember turning the key, yet doubt lingers in their mind. This kind of statement is different from the classic Moorian sentence, but it follows a similar pattern. The person acknowledges an action while simultaneously expressing doubt in their belief. This paradox also relates to self-deception. Suppose someone repeatedly tells themselves, "I am happy, but I don't believe I am happy." This statement could reveal a psychological struggle. They recognize their words, but their internal belief does not match. People often tell themselves things that they wish were true, but do not fully accept. In this way, Moore's paradox appears in situations where people struggle with their own emotions or self-perception. Lying adds another layer to the paradox. Normally, when people lie, they make statements that they know are false while trying to convince others that they are true. A politician might say, "The economy is strong," even if they believe it is weak. But a Moorian liar would say, "The economy is strong, but I don't believe the economy is strong." This type of statement does not work well as a deception because it exposes the lie within the same sentence. A liar typically hides their disbelief rather than openly stating it. Moore's paradox also appears in dreams. People sometimes wake up from a vivid dream and say, "That was a dream, but I don't believe it was a dream." In the moment, the dream felt real, and even after waking, the feeling lingers. Their knowledge and their belief temporarily disconnect. A similar experience happens with optical illusions. If a person looks at an illusion that makes two objects appear different in size, they might say, "The two shapes are the same size, but I don't believe they are the same size." Their knowledge tells them one thing, but their perception resists the truth. Philosophers have explored variations of this paradox in different contexts. Some have applied it to skepticism. A radical skeptic might say, "I know there is an external world, but I don't believe there is an external world." They acknowledge the common assumption that reality exists but struggle to fully accept it. This kind of thinking can lead to deeper philosophical problems about doubt, certainty, and existence. In a social context, this paradox can manifest in discussions about trust. A person might say, "I trust my friend, but I don't believe I trust my friend." This could indicate an internal conflict. On one level, they acknowledge trust, but deep down, they question it. Relationships often involve this type of contradiction. A person might say, "I love my partner, but I don't believe I love my partner," expressing uncertainty about their emotions. Language plays a key role in why this paradox feels so strange. In most cases, belief and assertion go together. When a person speaks, they usually expect others to assume they believe what they are saying. This expectation is so strong that breaking it feels unnatural. If a person said, "I am reading this sentence, but I don't believe I am reading this sentence," listeners would struggle to understand what they mean. The contradiction is not in the sentence itself, but in how people process beliefs and statements. Computer logic faces a similar issue. In programming, statements are either true or false. A system that encounters a statement like, "This function is running, but I don't believe this function is running," would struggle to process it. Computers operate on strict logical principles, so belief-based contradictions do not fit within their framework. This shows that Moore's paradox is deeply tied to human psychology rather than pure logic. The paradox also applies in debates and arguments. If someone says, "The statistics show crime is decreasing, but I don't believe crime is decreasing," their words suggest bias. They acknowledge the data but refuse to accept the conclusion. This kind of reasoning happens in political discussions where people's beliefs override facts. Someone might say, "The study proves vaccines are safe, but I don't believe vaccines are safe," illustrating how personal belief can persist even when confronted with evidence. Moore's paradox is not just a linguistic puzzle. It reveals the complex relationship between knowledge, belief, and communication. It highlights how people expect statements to reflect belief and how breaking that expectation creates confusion. Whether in everyday speech, philosophy, psychology, or artificial intelligence, this paradox challenges assumptions about how thought and language connect. A person's identity is built on memories. Every experience, every lesson learned, and every decision made contributes to how people see themselves. But memories are not perfect records of the past. They change over time. People misremember things. Sometimes they recall events that never happened. If memories shape identity but can be false, then how much of identity is real? A child remembers being lost in a store when they were 5 years old. They recall the feeling of panic, the bright overhead lights, and the voice of an employee asking if they needed help. That memory becomes a part of their identity. It explains their fear of crowded places. It justifies their tendency to stay close to familiar people. Years later, a parent hears them tell this story and says it never happened. The child was never lost. They never wandered away. They never cried for help. Yet the memory feels real. It shaped their behavior and self-perception. If that memory is false, what does that say about the parts of their identity that formed because of it? False memories are common. People mix up details, fill in gaps, or even create entire events in their minds. This isn't always intentional. Memory is reconstructive, not like a video recording. The brain stores pieces of information and rebuilds them when recalled. That means every time someone remembers something, they may be altering it slightly. Over time, memories shift, even when people believe they are accurate. A woman recalls an old friend from high school as someone who was always supportive. She remembers the long conversations and the way that friend stood up for her during an argument. But another classmate remembers things differently. They say the friend wasn't actually supportive. In fact, they spread rumors and only acted kind when it was convenient. The woman struggles with this contradiction. If her memory is wrong, then how much of her understanding of herself is also wrong? If she built part of her identity around a friendship that wasn't real in the way she remembers, what else about her past is unreliable? Eyewitness testimony in criminal cases provides one of the clearest examples of how memories fail. Many people convicted of crimes based on eyewitness accounts have later been proven innocent through DNA evidence. A witness may feel completely certain that they saw someone commit a crime. They remember the person's face, the clothes they wore, and the way they moved. But later, evidence shows they were mistaken. The human brain does not work like a perfect camera. It fills in details, especially when under stress. If people can be wrong about something as serious as witnessing a crime, then they can certainly be wrong about personal events in their own lives. Identity is closely tied to personal history. People see themselves as shaped by the things they've been through. Someone who remembers overcoming a tough childhood might believe it made them stronger. Someone who remembers an embarrassing failure may carry that as a core part of who they are. If those memories change or are revealed to be false, their sense of self is affected. A man recalls being bullied in school. He remembers the names he was called and the way people laughed at him. He believes this experience made him more resilient. But years later, he attends a school reunion and hears a different version. Former classmates remember him as well-liked. A teacher insists he was always surrounded by friends. If they are right, then what does that mean for the identity he has carried all these years? He thought of himself as someone who struggled and overcame hardship. But if the hardship wasn't real in the way he remembered, then what part of him is real? Even deeply personal memories can shift. A person might remember an important life lesson from their mother, only to later learn that the advice actually came from a book or a different person. This change in memory can be unsettling. People trust their memories to define themselves. They rely on them to provide continuity. If memories shift, then identity becomes less stable. People often rewrite their own past without realizing it. Nostalgia can make childhood seem happier than it was. Regret can make past mistakes seem worse. Over time, memories are edited to fit current beliefs and emotions. Someone who once loved a hobby but later loses interest might remember it as never having been that enjoyable. Someone who falls out with a close friend might start recalling more negative moments and forgetting the good times. If identity depends on memory, and memory constantly changes, then how much of identity is based on reality? Studies in psychology show that memory is highly suggestible. When people are asked to recall an event, the way a question is worded can influence their response. If someone is asked how fast two cars were going when they smashed into each other, they are more likely to remember the accident as more severe than if they were asked how fast the cars were going when they bumped into each other. This means that identity, which is built on recalled experiences, can be shaped by outside influence. If someone repeatedly hears that they were a troublemaker as a child, they may start to believe it, even if their own memories don't support it. This problem extends beyond individual identity into collective memory. A family may have a shared story about a relative that has been passed down through generations. That story becomes part of the family's identity. But as details are forgotten or changed, the truth becomes harder to separate from fiction. Nations, cultures, and communities build identities based on shared histories that may be incomplete or inaccurate. If identity depends on memory, and memory is flexible, then how much of any identity is real? A person who remembers being deeply hurt by someone may carry resentment for years. But what if their memory is distorted? What if their recollection of the argument is missing important details? If they later learn that the other person never said the words they remember, or that the situation wasn't as one-sided as they believed, does that mean their feelings were based on something that never truly happened? Therapists often encounter cases where clients uncover false memories. Some people vividly recall traumatic events that evidence later disproves. Others repress painful memories and only recover them years later. The brain does not store experiences in perfect detail. Instead, it constructs narratives that fit the current understanding of the past. That means people's sense of who they are is based on stories that may not be entirely true. A soldier remembers a moment in battle where they made a split-second decision that saved lives. That memory defines them. It gives them confidence and purpose. But another soldier who was there says it happened differently. The decision was made by someone else. The first soldier's role was much smaller than they recall. If they accept this version of events, how does it affect their self-image? If they do not, is their identity based on something that never happened? People build identities through experiences, lessons, and stories. These shape confidence, fears, relationships, and choices. But if those memories are not reliable, identity itself becomes uncertain. The past is always seen through the lens of the present. What someone remembers about their childhood depends on how they feel now. What someone believes about an old friendship depends on how they view that person today. If identity depends on something as fragile as memory, then it raises the question of what part of identity is real. Imagine you meet someone you haven't seen in 10 years. You recognize them. Their voice, mannerisms, and even their way of thinking still feel familiar. But during that time, almost every cell in their body has been replaced. The atoms that made up their skin, blood, and bones a decade ago are now gone. If their physical body has been entirely replaced, are they still the same person? This question, known as the identity paradox, challenges how we define personal identity. People tend to assume they remain the same over time. They remember past experiences and assume continuity. but biology tells a different story. Human cells are in a constant state of renewal. Skin cells last a few weeks, red blood cells live for about 4 months, and even bone cells are gradually replaced over several years. Estimates suggest that nearly every cell in the body is replaced within a decade. If identity is tied to the physical body, this creates a problem. If none of the same physical matter remains, what makes someone the same person over time? A useful way to explore this question is through the ship of Theseus thought experiment. Imagine a wooden ship that has its planks replaced one by one over many years. Eventually, every original piece is gone. Is it still the same ship? If someone collected the discarded planks and rebuilt the ship elsewhere, which one would be the real ship of Theseus? The same question applies to human identity. If the body undergoes constant renewal, what keeps a person themselves over time? Some argue that identity is more than just the physical body. They believe continuity comes from memory and consciousness. Even if the body's cells are replaced, a person's experiences and thoughts create a sense of self that persists. Memory provides a link to the past, allowing people to feel as though they have remained the same despite physical changes. But memory is imperfect. People forget things. Memories fade or change over time. If identity relies on memory, then what happens to those who suffer memory loss? If someone forgets their past, are they still the same person? This question becomes even more complicated when considering severe cases of memory loss, such as amnesia or dementia. If a person with Alzheimer's no longer remembers their own name or recognizes their loved ones, are they still the same person they once were? If identity depends on memories, then losing them seems to erase the self. But if identity is tied to something deeper, like consciousness or personality, then some part of the person remains, even if they no longer recall their past. Another way to approach this paradox is through the role of the brain. The brain is constantly changing. Neural connections form and disappear as people learn and grow. Studies in neuroscience show that even personality traits can shift over time. Someone who was once shy can become outgoing. A person who once loved music might lose interest. If identity is tied to the brain, does this mean people become entirely new individuals as their thoughts and behaviors evolve? If someone suffers a brain injury that alters their personality, are they the same person they were before? The paradox also challenges how society treats personal responsibility. Legal systems assume a person remains the same over time. If someone commits a crime at 20 years old, they can still be held accountable for it at 40. But if their body and mind have changed, are they truly the same person who committed the crime? The law treats identity as continuous, even though science suggests the self is in flux. This creates an ethical dilemma. Should someone be punished for actions taken by a past version of themselves that no longer exists in the same physical form? Some philosophers argue that identity is not a fixed thing, but a process. Instead of being a single, unchanging entity, a person is a collection of experiences, memories, and physical changes that create the illusion of stability. This perspective suggests that identity is not something people have, but something they do. It emerges through interaction, thought, and memory, rather than being a static essence. One example that highlights this issue is organ transplants. If someone receives a heart transplant, they are still considered the same person. But what if science advanced to the point where a person could receive a full-body transplant, keeping only their original brain? Would they still be the same individual? Some might say yes, since the brain holds memories and personality. But what if the opposite were true? If a brain transplant were possible and someone's brain was placed in a new body, would they still be the same person? This suggests that identity might be more tied to the brain than the body. The paradox extends to digital identity as well. Imagine a person who uploads their consciousness to a computer. If a perfect digital copy of their mind exists, with all their memories and thoughts intact, is that copy the same person? If the original biological person still exists, then there are two versions of the same individual. But if the biological person dies, does the digital version continue to be them? If identity is tied to consciousness and memory, then in theory, the digital version should be the same person. But if identity is tied to a specific body, then the digital copy is just a replica. Personal identity also shifts across cultures and beliefs. Some traditions view the self as fluid, constantly shaped by experiences and relationships. Others see identity as something fixed, an unchanging core that defines a person. The paradox challenges both views. If identity is fluid, then there is no single self to hold on to. If it is fixed, then where does it exist when the body and mind constantly change? A real-world case that highlights this paradox is dissociative identity disorder, DID, where a single individual exhibits multiple distinct identities. Each identity has its own memories, personality, and even neurological patterns. If identity were singular and continuous, this disorder should not be possible. But if identity can fragment and change, then the self is more complex than it appears. This raises difficult questions. If one identity in a person with DID commits a crime, should another identity in the same body be held accountable? If identity is tied to memory and consciousness, then which identity is the real one? Even in everyday life, the paradox appears in subtle ways. People often feel different from who they were in the past. A person might look back at their teenage self and feel disconnected, as though that version of them was an entirely different person. They might say, "I don't even recognize who I was back then." If they feel so different from their past self, what exactly has remained the same? If identity persists through change, what is the core element that makes someone the same despite those changes? The paradox also raises questions about cloning. If a perfect genetic clone of a person were created, would that clone be the same individual? They would have the same DNA, but their experiences and memories would be different. If identity depends on personal history rather than biology, then the clone is a separate individual. But if identity is linked to physical form, then the clone should, in theory, be the same. This issue is not just theoretical. It affects real-world decisions in medicine, law, and ethics. Understanding the nature of identity impacts everything from criminal justice to artificial intelligence. It forces people to question what makes them who they are and whether they are truly the same person over time. Quantum mechanics challenges how people understand reality. The quantum observer paradox raises a fundamental question. If observation affects the state of a system, what happens when no one is watching? This idea comes from experiments in quantum physics that show particles behave differently when measured. Scientists have found that observation does not just reveal reality, but seems to shape it. This contradicts the everyday experience of a stable world existing whether or not someone is there to see it. One of the best-known examples of this paradox comes from the double-slit experiment. When scientists shine light or fire electrons at a barrier with two slits, the particles create an interference pattern on the other side. This pattern suggests that each particle moves like a wave, passing through both slits at once. But when someone measures which slit the particle goes through, the interference pattern disappears. Instead, the particle behaves like a solid object, passing through only one slit. The simple act of measuring changes the outcome. If the observer had not measured, the particle would have acted like a wave. Since it was measured, it behaved like a particle. This experiment suggests that, at a quantum level, particles do not have definite positions or states until they are observed. Before measurement, they exist in a superposition, meaning they take all possible paths at once. The moment an observer measures them, they collapse into a single state. This leads to a strange question. If an object is not observed, does it exist in a definite state at all? The answer seems to depend on measurement. But if measurement changes reality, then reality does not exist in a fixed way without an observer. This idea is not just a theoretical problem. It appears in real-world quantum experiments. Scientists have tested how observation changes results by delaying when they measure particles. In some cases, they decide whether to measure after the particle has already passed through the slits. Even though the event has already happened, the delayed measurement still changes the outcome. It is as if the particle knows whether it will be observed in the future and adjusts accordingly. This leads to a bigger question. What counts as an observer? In classical physics, reality is independent of the observer. A rock on the ground exists whether or not anyone sees it. In quantum mechanics, an observer does not have to be a person. A measuring device can also collapse a quantum state. Some physicists argue that anything interacting with a quantum system counts as an observer. Others suggest that true observation requires consciousness. If only conscious beings collapse quantum states, then the nature of reality depends on whether someone is aware of it. This idea raises the paradoxical thought that without an observer, reality might not settle into a definite state. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? In quantum mechanics, the question is more extreme. If no one observes the tree, is it even in a definite place? If every particle in the tree exists in a superposition until observed, then in some sense, the tree itself may not fully exist until someone looks at it. This leads to an unsettling idea about the universe itself. The universe existed long before humans. But if observation determines reality, what kept the universe in a definite state before observers evolved? Some physicists argue that large systems collapse their own quantum states. In this view, the Sun and Earth became stable long before humans arrived because complex systems interact in ways that act like measurements. Others suggest that the universe itself requires a fundamental observer. This has led to interpretations where consciousness plays a role in shaping reality. Some scientists reject this interpretation and say that observation does not create reality, but only forces it into one state. In this view, quantum systems always exist in some definite form, but measurement reveals which one. The problem is that no one can prove what happens before measurement. Quantum mechanics only predicts what will happen when something is measured. What happens before that remains unknown. Some interpretations suggest reality constantly branches into different possibilities, and measurement just picks one. In this view, all possible outcomes exist, but humans only experience one of them. The paradox becomes even stranger when applied to living things. Schrödinger's cat is a famous thought experiment that shows how quantum mechanics can affect everyday objects. In this experiment, a cat is placed in a box with a radioactive atom. If the atom decays, it triggers poison that kills the cat. If the atom does not decay, the cat stays alive. Since radioactive decay is a quantum event, the atom exists in a superposition of decayed and not decayed until measured. If the atom's state is uncertain, then so is the cat's fate. Until someone opens the box, the cat is both alive and dead at the same time. This idea seems absurd because people do not see cats existing in two states. But the experiment shows how quantum uncertainty could scale up to larger objects. If quantum rules apply to everything, then the same principle applies to larger things, including living creatures. The paradox highlights the gap between quantum mechanics and human experience. People see a world of solid objects that exist whether or not they are watched. But at the smallest level, reality does not behave this way. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics avoid this paradox by proposing that measurement is just one possible explanation. One alternative is the many worlds interpretation. In this view, the universe splits into different versions every time a quantum event happens. In one universe, the cat lives. In another, the cat dies. Both outcomes happen, but each exists in a separate world. In this interpretation, observation does not change reality. Instead, it determines which version of reality the observer experiences. Another interpretation is quantum decoherence. This idea suggests that quantum superpositions do not collapse due to observation, but instead break down when they interact with large systems. In this view, objects seem to have definite states because interactions with the environment force them into stable conditions. This avoids the need for an observer, but still raises questions about why reality takes one form instead of another. The paradox also connects to artificial intelligence and consciousness. If observation creates reality, then machines that measure quantum states could count as observers. But if only consciousness collapses reality, then artificial intelligence would not have the same effect as a human observer. This raises deeper questions about what makes something conscious and whether reality depends on awareness or just interaction. The quantum observer paradox challenges basic assumptions about reality. It suggests that the universe might not exist in a definite form unless something observes it. This idea raises philosophical, scientific, and even existential questions. It forces people to reconsider what they mean by existence and reality. in a world where observation plays a fundamental role. An impossible object is a shape that cannot exist in the real world, yet people can describe, draw, and imagine it. The Penrose triangle is a well-known example. It looks like a solid three-dimensional object, but its geometry defies reality. No matter how someone tries to build it, the angles do not connect in a way that makes physical sense. This creates a paradox. If something cannot exist, how can a person see it in their mind and put it on paper? The contradiction lies in the way human perception and logic interact. A person can picture a Penrose triangle, even though their brain knows it is not a real object. The drawing uses shading and perspective tricks to create an illusion. The mind interprets these visual cues as depth and solidity. When looking at the triangle, the brain assumes that each corner connects correctly because it follows the normal rules of vision. But when trying to trace the object logically, the connections fall apart. The object breaks the rules of Euclidean space, yet it appears to be stable. This is not just a trick of art, but a deep issue in how the mind processes reality. Impossible objects like the Penrose triangle reveal a gap between seeing and understanding. The brain evolved to recognize patterns and interpret depth cues quickly. In everyday life, this helps people navigate the world efficiently. But this same ability makes the brain vulnerable to illusions. The Penrose triangle presents a shape that the brain treats as normal, even though logical reasoning proves it is not. The paradox arises because perception and logic do not always align. Another well-known impossible object is the Penrose stairs. This structure appears to be a staircase that always ascends or descends in a loop. A person looking at the drawing might believe that someone could walk up the stairs forever without ever gaining height. This, of course, is impossible. No real staircase can loop in such a way. Yet the mind perceives it as real because each individual step follows the normal rules of perspective. The paradox is not in the drawing itself, but in how the brain interprets it. The ability to imagine impossible objects raises questions about the nature of reality. If a person can conceive something that cannot exist, what does that mean about the limits of thought? Some argue that these paradoxes show how human perception is not a perfect reflection of the world. The brain constructs a model of reality based on limited information. This model is usually accurate enough for survival, but it can be tricked. The fact that someone can picture an impossible object suggests that imagination is not bound by physical constraints. This paradox extends beyond simple drawings. Fiction and dreams often contain impossible elements. A person might dream of walking through a door and arriving at a place that should be miles away. In a dream, this does not seem strange, even though it breaks the laws of physics. The same happens in fictional stories where characters travel through portals or experience time loops. These ideas make sense within their own framework, even though they cannot happen in the real world. The paradox is that the mind accepts these concepts as coherent, even when logic says they should not be. Mathematics also encounters impossible objects. Consider the idea of a four-dimensional cube, known as a tesseract. A person can describe it mathematically and even draw projections of it, but no one can truly picture a four-dimensional shape because human vision is limited to 3 dimensions. Despite this, the tesseract is a well-defined concept in geometry. The paradox is similar to the Penrose triangle. If the object cannot exist in normal space, why can it be studied and visualized in some form? The paradox of impossible objects also connects to optical illusions. Many illusions rely on perspective tricks that force the brain to interpret an image incorrectly. The Miller-Lyer illusion, where 2 lines of equal length appear different due to arrow-like markings at the ends, demonstrates this effect. The brain makes assumptions about depth and distance that are not accurate. These illusions show that perception is not always reliable. If the brain can misinterpret a simple line drawing, it is no surprise that it can also see an impossible object as real. Technology has introduced new ways to explore this paradox. Computer-generated images and virtual reality can create environments where impossible objects seem to exist. A digital model of a Penrose triangle can be rotated in ways that make it look real from certain angles. Video games often use non-Euclidean geometry to create spaces that defy real-world physics. A character in a game might turn a corner and find themselves back where they started, even though they walked in a straight line. This effect mirrors the logic of impossible objects, allowing people to experience paradoxical spaces. Art and architecture have also played with this idea. The works of M.C. Escher feature impossible buildings and endless staircases. His drawings show figures walking in loops that defy gravity. These images feel logical at first glance, but closer inspection reveals the impossibilities. Some architects have designed structures that mimic Escher's style, using perspective tricks to create the illusion of impossible spaces. These designs rely on the fact that the brain interprets depth based on certain assumptions, which can be manipulated. Some philosophers argue that the paradox of impossible objects reflects the limits of human knowledge. If the brain can conceive of things that cannot exist, does this mean that reality itself is unknowable? Perhaps there are aspects of the universe that do not follow human logic, just as the Penrose triangle does not follow normal geometry. This idea challenges the assumption that the world operates in a way that the mind can fully grasp. It suggests that human understanding is shaped by perception, not by reality itself. Psychologists have studied how people react to impossible objects. Some experiments show that children are more likely to accept these objects without questioning them. As people grow older, they rely more on logical reasoning, which makes them recognize the impossibilities. This shift suggests that the ability to process paradoxes develops over time. It also shows that the brain does not always prioritize strict logic. Instead, it balances perception and reasoning, sometimes favoring one over the other. The paradox of impossible objects also appears in language. Some sentences describe situations that cannot happen, yet they still make sense grammatically. Consider the phrase, "a square circle." This describes an impossible shape, but the words themselves are understandable. Similarly, logical contradictions like, "this statement is false," create a loop that defies resolution. These examples show that language, like vision, can construct ideas that are logically impossible but still meaningful in some way. Science fiction often explores this paradox by presenting realities that operate on different physical rules. Some stories describe planets where space loops back on itself, making travel nonlinear. Others imagine dimensions where impossible objects can exist naturally. These ideas push the boundaries of what people consider possible. They show that even when logic says something cannot exist, the imagination can still process and expand upon it. Philosophy has long debated whether impossible objects prove that reality is different from how people perceive it. Some argue that the paradox is a flaw in human thinking, a sign that perception is not always accurate. Others suggest that it reveals something deeper about the nature of existence. If the mind can create things that do not follow the laws of physics, then those laws might not be as rigid as they seem. This raises questions about the relationship between thought and reality. The paradox of impossible objects remains an open problem. It challenges the way people think about vision, perception, and logic. It shows that the mind is capable of constructing ideas that defy reality. It suggests that human understanding has limits, yet at the same time, it expands what people can imagine. The contradiction at its core is simple. If something cannot exist, then why does the brain insist on seeing it? A legal system operates under rules that define how laws are created, amended, and repealed. Some laws remain unchanged for centuries, while others shift to fit evolving societies. In most systems, laws follow a structured process where new legislation must align with existing rules. But what happens if a law claims the power to invalidate all previous laws? This idea creates a logical contradiction. If the law succeeds, it erases the foundation that made its own existence possible. If it fails, then it does not truly have the power it claims. This is the self-amendment paradox, a fundamental issue in legal philosophy. Consider a government that decides to simplify its legal system. Lawmakers introduce a new law that states all previous laws are null and void. At first glance, this seems like a clean slate. Every regulation, statute, and legal precedent disappears. But a problem emerges. If all laws are void, then the rules that allowed the new law to pass are also gone. Without those rules, the new law itself loses its legitimacy. In trying to erase the past, it erases itself. This paradox challenges the way laws derive their authority. Imagine a fictional country where lawmakers debate overcomplicated legal codes. Frustrated with contradictions and outdated laws, they draft a sweeping new statute. It reads, "This law overrides all previous laws and replaces them with a new legal framework." They pass it through the legislative process, and it becomes official. But this raises a question. If all previous laws are gone, what gives this new law its authority? If the Constitution or legislative procedures that allowed this change no longer exist, then the law itself has no legal foundation. The system collapses under its own reform. This paradox applies not only to entire legal systems, but also to amendments within them. Many constitutions include provisions for self-amendment, meaning they allow changes to their own structure. A government may introduce an amendment that gives itself unlimited power, overriding previous restrictions. But if the amendment process follows existing legal rules, then it still depends on them. If those rules disappear, the amendment may lose its own legitimacy. It cannot stand alone without the very structure it dismantles. A historical example can be found in revolutionary governments. When a new regime overthrows an old one, it often declares previous laws void. However, to establish control, it still needs some form of legal order. In practice, even the most radical revolutions retain portions of previous legal systems to avoid chaos. The paradox becomes clear when a government claims absolute legal authority, but still relies on remnants of the past for legitimacy. A similar problem arises in company policies. Suppose a corporation drafts a new internal rule stating that all previous company policies are abolished, including the policy that established this new rule. If enforced, it destroys its own validity. Employees would be left in a legal vacuum with no structure to follow. If challenged, the company would need to recognize some authority, either past policies or a higher governing body, to justify the change. Without that, the policy contradicts itself. This paradox also appears in computer programming. A programmer might write a piece of code that deletes all previous data, including the command that triggered the deletion. If the system executes the command, it may delete the very instructions needed to process further operations. The program effectively destroys its own ability to function. This mirrors the legal paradox in a digital form. Contracts present another example. If a contract includes a clause that states, "This contract invalidates all previous agreements, including itself," then what remains enforceable? If the clause is true, then the contract erases itself. If it is false, then the previous agreements may still hold weight. This contradiction makes it impossible to determine the legal standing of any agreement. Philosophically, this paradox ties into broader questions about self-reference and circular reasoning. A statement that negates itself cannot be consistently true or false. If a government's legal system allows a law that wipes out all past laws, it enters this same logical loop. It either destroys its own legitimacy or remains bound by the laws it tried to erase. A real-world case that touches on this issue is constitutional suspension during emergencies. Some governments grant themselves emergency powers that override existing laws. But if they suspend the very laws that define their powers, they risk undermining their own legitimacy. If a constitution permits its own suspension, then during that suspension, it ceases to provide authority. This can create legal uncertainty where the system both does and does not exist at the same time. Military coups sometimes face this paradox. A new ruler may dissolve a previous government and claim total control. However, if they justify their rule by citing constitutional authority, they must acknowledge the previous system. If they ignore it completely, they lack any legal framework to enforce their rule. In both cases, they must either accept remnants of the past or operate in a legal void. This paradox can also appear in personal decision-making. Suppose someone declares, "From now on, I will follow no rules, including this rule." If they adhere to their statement, then they must abandon the rule itself. If they ignore it, then they contradict their own commitment. The paradox creates an unstable position where neither possibility remains consistent. Legal theorists debate whether any system can truly erase itself. Some argue that legal systems always evolve rather than restart. Even when governments collapse, some form of legal continuity remains. Others suggest that radical breaks can occur, but require external authority to enforce them. Without an external framework, a law that invalidates all previous laws loses its own grounding. A legal system must maintain consistency to function. If laws contradict themselves, courts struggle to enforce them. The self-amendment paradox highlights how legal authority depends on continuity. A law that erases its own foundation creates uncertainty. In practical terms, most legal systems avoid this paradox by ensuring that fundamental rules cannot be abolished outright. Understanding this paradox sheds light on broader issues of governance, authority, and self-referential logic. When legal systems amend themselves, they must do so in a way that preserves their own validity. A law that nullifies all past laws, including the laws that allowed it to exist, enters an endless loop where it both is and isn't valid. This contradiction forces legal scholars to consider whether absolute legal resets are even possible, or whether legal continuity is always necessary for stability. Doubt is often seen as a tool for finding truth. People question what they hear, what they see, and what they believe. Doubt is useful when it leads to better understanding, but it also presents a problem. If someone doubts everything, they must also doubt their own doubt. This creates a loop where certainty becomes impossible. The more someone questions, the less stable their thinking becomes. This is the circle of doubt paradox. A person who doubts everything cannot escape their own skepticism. Imagine someone who believes that all knowledge is unreliable. If they hold this belief, they must also doubt whether their own judgment about knowledge is reliable. If their judgment is unreliable, then their belief that all knowledge is unreliable may itself be incorrect. This puts them in a paradoxical state where they cannot trust even their own reasoning. Philosophy has long struggled with this problem. Ancient skeptics argued that nothing could be known for certain. This position is self-defeating because it requires assuming that the claim nothing can be known is true. If the claim is true, then at least one thing is certain, the fact that nothing is certain. This contradicts itself. A person who truly believes in radical skepticism must also believe that their own skepticism is questionable. If they accept that their skepticism is questionable, they admit the possibility of certainty. If they reject this possibility, they must doubt the reliability of their own doubt, leading them back to uncertainty. Consider a person who constantly questions whether their memories are accurate. If they distrust all their past experiences, they have no foundation for understanding their own life. If they start doubting their doubts, they reach a state where no thought can be trusted. They may try to use logic to navigate this uncertainty, but logic itself relies on rules that they might also question. This can create a mental loop where every thought cancels itself out. This paradox is similar to the classic problem of self-referential statements. This statement is false, cannot be true or false without contradicting itself. The same issue appears with self-doubt. If a person believes their own reasoning is flawed, they must question whether that very belief is also flawed. If it is, then their reasoning might be correct after all. This constant reversal makes stable thinking impossible. Some philosophers have tried to resolve this paradox by drawing a distinction between different levels of doubt. They argue that doubting external facts is different from doubting the ability to doubt itself. A scientist might question the results of an experiment, but still trust the scientific method. A historian might challenge the accuracy of a document, but still believe that history can be studied objectively. These forms of doubt are constructive. They allow people to refine their understanding without falling into an endless loop of uncertainty. However, radical doubt does not allow for this separation. If someone believes that even their tools for understanding the world are unreliable, they have no way to escape skepticism. This is why extreme philosophical skepticism often leads to inaction. If nothing can be trusted, then no belief or action can be justified. A person caught in this mindset may feel trapped, unable to move forward with any decision. A real-world example of this paradox can be seen in conspiracy theories. Some people doubt everything they hear from official sources. If they believe all media is manipulated, they must also question the sources they use to support their own beliefs. If they accept some sources as reliable, they contradict their claim that everything is controlled. If they reject all sources, They have no basis for any belief. This leads to a state where no argument can ever be settled because every claim is met with more skepticism. In psychological terms, excessive doubt can lead to anxiety and indecision. People who constantly question their own choices may struggle to make even small decisions. If someone doubts their ability to choose wisely, they may hesitate indefinitely, fearing that any choice could be wrong. If they doubt their hesitation, they may second-guess their second-guessing, falling deeper into uncertainty. The circle of doubt paradox also appears in discussions about artificial intelligence and machine learning. If an AI is programmed to doubt its own conclusions, it may enter an endless feedback loop. Every output it generates would be subject to more analysis, leading to infinite processing without resolution. This is one reason why AI systems are designed with limits on self-correction. Without these limits, the system could become locked in a cycle of self-questioning. Another example comes from religious and philosophical debates about faith and skepticism. Some argue that questioning religious beliefs is necessary for personal growth. Others warn that questioning too much can lead to a loss of meaning. If someone doubts the existence of a higher power, they may also doubt their reasons for doubting. If their doubt weakens, they may return to belief, only to question it again later. This cycle can repeat indefinitely, making it difficult to settle on a final position. Doubt is essential for progress, but it becomes dangerous when it turns inward. If every assumption is questioned without limit, certainty becomes impossible. The circle of doubt paradox forces people to confront the limits of skepticism. Without some foundation for belief, even the act of thinking becomes unstable. This paradox reveals the fine line between healthy questioning and self-destructive uncertainty. To judge what is true, you need a standard. That standard, or criterion, must already be trusted before you use it. But how do you judge the criterion itself? If you say the criterion is valid, you must base that on something. That creates a loop. You need truth to judge the criterion, but you need a criterion to judge truth. This is the problem of the criterion. Imagine a courtroom. A judge must decide whether a piece of evidence is admissible. The court has rules for evidence, but where did those rules come from? They must have been set by an authority, perhaps lawmakers or past court rulings. But what gave those lawmakers the authority to decide? If they needed some standard to write the law, who created that standard? At some point, you either accept the rules without justification or keep searching for an ultimate foundation that might not exist. The philosopher Roderick Chisholm made this paradox clear. He argued that every search for truth runs into two questions. First, what do we know? Second, how do we decide what we know? The first question assumes that we already have knowledge. The second asks for a method to verify it. But answering either question depends on the other. If you start with knowledge, you need a way to confirm that knowledge is valid. If you start with a method, you need to prove that the method itself is trustworthy. Either way, you are stuck in a circle. This paradox appears in daily life. When you hear news, how do you know it is true? You might say you trust reliable sources, but how do you know they are reliable? You might point to their past accuracy, but how do you measure accuracy? If you compare sources against each other, you assume that at least one of them is correct. But how do you decide which one? The problem repeats itself. This also happens in science. Scientists test hypotheses using experiments. They trust the scientific method to give reliable results. But why trust the scientific method? The usual answer is that it has worked before. That assumes past success guarantees future success. But that itself is a principle called induction, which also needs justification. If you justify induction by saying it has worked before, you rely on induction to prove induction, creating a loop. Consider a historian researching the past. They compare documents, artifacts, and accounts. But how do they judge which accounts are true? They might say some sources are more reliable, but how do they know? If they say those sources have been accurate in the past, they assume past reliability proves current truth. If they rely on multiple sources agreeing, they assume consensus equals truth. Both methods require a criterion that itself needs validation. This problem shows up in ethics. If someone says lying is wrong, you can ask why. They might say it is harmful. But why does harm make something wrong? They might appeal to a moral principle like fairness or human dignity. But how do they justify that principle? They either assume it is self-evident or base it on another principle, which itself needs justification. If they try to ground ethics in logic, they must explain why logical consistency matters in moral reasoning. Every answer leads to another question. Religious beliefs also face this issue. A person might believe a religious text is true. If you ask why, they might say it comes from a divine source. If you ask how they know that source is real, they might say the text itself confirms it. That is circular. If they appeal to personal experience, they need a way to verify that experience. If they cite historical evidence, they must justify trusting those historical records. The problem remains the same. In mathematics, the problem appears in axioms. Every mathematical system starts with basic assumptions. These axioms are not proven, they are accepted as starting points. But why accept them? The usual answer is that they seem self-evident or that they work well in practice. But both justifications assume that reason or usefulness determines truth. If someone doubts those assumptions, there is no deeper proof to offer. Language has this problem too. When you define a word, you use other words. Those words also have definitions, which rely on more words. If you keep defining words in terms of other words, you never reach a final, self-sufficient meaning. At some point, people must agree on basic meanings without deeper proof. The same issue arises in logic. Logical rules help people reason correctly. But how do we justify logic itself? If we use logic to prove logic, we assume what we are trying to justify. If we reject logic, we lose the ability to argue coherently. This creates a dilemma. Either logic is self-justified without proof, or it depends on something beyond logic, which is difficult to explain. This paradox matters in practical decisions. If you want to buy a car, you research different models. You compare prices, reliability, and reviews. But how do you trust the reviews? You might check multiple sources. But how do you decide which sources are credible? You might say a source has been accurate before, but how do you measure past accuracy? You might rely on expert opinions, but how do you know those experts are truly experts? This chain of reasoning continues without a clear endpoint. Education faces this problem as well. When a student learns history, they trust their textbooks. But how do they know the textbook is correct? They might say experts wrote it, but how do they know those experts were correct? They might say other scholars verify the information, but how do they know those scholars used a reliable method? Every step requires trust in something before it. Legal systems also struggle with this paradox. Courts operate on laws, and laws rest on legal principles. But how do lawmakers justify those principles? Some might say the principles come from tradition. But why trust tradition? Others might say laws reflect the will of the people. But how do you define the people's will? If laws come from ethics, then ethics must be justified first. This cycle makes legal foundations difficult to pin down. This paradox even affects artificial intelligence. AI models are trained on data. But how do we judge if the data is good? The usual answer is that experts curate it. But how do we judge those experts? If AI systems check themselves for accuracy, they assume their training data was correct. If humans check AI outputs, they assume human judgment is correct. Either way, something is taken for granted. Advertising also reveals this issue. A company claims its product is the best. How do consumers verify that? They might look at reviews, but how do they know the reviews are genuine? They might trust word of mouth. But how do they know their friends are unbiased? Every method of judgment requires assuming something is trustworthy first. Personal beliefs are shaped by this problem. If someone believes in free will, they might say people make choices independently. But how do they know? They might argue that personal experience confirms it. But how do they trust their own perception? If they say science supports free will, they must assume scientific methods are valid. If they reject free will, they must trust the reasoning that led them there. Every belief depends on some foundation that itself cannot be fully justified. The problem of the criterion shows why doubt is unavoidable. If you question how you know something, you eventually reach a point where no further justification is possible. Some people accept foundational beliefs without proof. Others search for deeper reasoning, only to find themselves caught in an endless loop. Every judgment relies on something before it, and that dependence makes certainty difficult to achieve. Russell's no-class paradox arises from a simple question in set theory. Some sets contain themselves as members, and some do not. The paradox appears when asking whether the set of all sets that do not contain themselves includes itself. If it does, then by definition, it should not. If it does not, then it must contain itself. This contradiction creates a logical issue that challenges the foundations of mathematics. To understand this paradox, imagine a library that keeps a list of all books that do not reference themselves. The librarian must decide whether to include the list itself in the list. If the list is included, then it references itself and should not be on the list. If the librarian leaves it out, then the list does not reference itself, so it should be included. No consistent answer resolves this contradiction. This paradox is similar to the barber paradox. Suppose a town has a barber who shaves all and only those men who do not shave themselves. The question becomes, does the barber shave himself? If he does, he should not, since he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. If he does not, then he must shave himself, as he shaves all men who do not shave themselves. The contradiction remains unresolved. Russell's paradox affects the foundation of set theory, which is the mathematical study of collections of objects. Early set theorists, including Georg Cantor, defined a set as any collection of objects with a shared property. Some sets, like the set of all even numbers, are clearly defined. Others, like the set of all things that exist, are more complex. Bertrand Russell discovered that this broad definition led to contradictions. He found that if unrestricted, set theory allowed paradoxical sets like the one that does not contain itself. This issue called into question the logical basis of mathematics. To see how this paradox challenges logic, consider a simple case. Define a set A that includes all sets that do not contain themselves. If A is in itself, then it does not belong by definition. If A is not in itself, then it must belong because it contains all sets that do not include themselves. The contradiction makes it impossible to decide whether A is part of itself or not. One way to avoid this paradox is by restricting how sets are defined. Mathematicians introduced more precise rules to prevent self-referential loops. One solution, called Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, limits the ways sets can be constructed. It ensures that no set can be defined in a way that leads to Russell's paradox. This prevents contradictions but changes how set theory works. Another way to think about the paradox is through real-world analogies. Suppose a company keeps records of all employees who do not manage themselves. If a new manager supervises everyone except themselves, should they be added to the list? If they are, they manage themselves and should not be on the list. If they are not, then they qualify for the list and must be added. The contradiction remains. Philosophers have used this paradox to explore self-reference in language. Consider the statement, "This sentence is false." If the statement is true, then it must be false. If it is false, then it must be true. The paradox creates an endless loop without resolution. Russell's paradox works in a similar way, but within mathematics rather than language. In computer science, self-referential problems appear in programming. A function that calls itself can create infinite loops. Consider a program designed to check whether other programs halt or run forever. If the program checks itself, it enters an infinite loop, leading to contradictions similar to those in Russell's paradox. This relates to Alan Turing's halting problem, which proves that no algorithm can determine whether all possible programs halt. Russell's paradox also connects to Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Kurt Gödel showed that any sufficiently complex mathematical system contains statements that are true but unprovable within that system. Just as Russell's paradox reveals inconsistencies in set theory, Gödel's theorems show that mathematical systems cannot be both complete and consistent. In practical terms, avoiding self-reference prevents logical contradictions. Many mathematical systems impose hierarchy to prevent sets from including themselves. This prevents paradoxes but limits the flexibility of set theory. Similar restrictions apply in databases, programming, and formal logic, where avoiding self-referential rules helps maintain consistency. Russell's paradox highlights the challenge of defining sets without contradiction. The idea of a set that contains all sets leads to problems when considering whether it includes itself. Solutions to this paradox shape modern mathematics, computer science, and logic, influencing how systems handle self-referential problems. Understanding this paradox reveals the complexity of defining collections, whether in abstract mathematics or real-world applications. A law student agrees to pay his teacher for his legal education only if he wins his first court case. The teacher, seeing an opportunity to ensure payment, decides to sue the student for the money. This creates a logical contradiction that leaves both the student and the teacher in a legal and philosophical dilemma. The teacher reasons that no matter what happens, the student must pay. If the court rules in favor of the teacher, then the student must pay because the verdict enforces the contract. If the court rules in favor of the student, then he has won his first case, which means that according to his own agreement, he must pay the teacher. In either situation, the teacher believes he will receive the payment. The student, however, sees things differently. He argues that no matter what the court decides, he should not have to pay. If he loses the case, the court has decided that he does not owe the money, so he does not have to pay. If he wins, then he has not yet won a case before the ruling is made, meaning that the condition to pay the teacher was never met. In both cases, he believes he does not have to pay. This paradox challenges legal reasoning because both arguments appear sound, yet they lead to completely opposite conclusions. If the court rules for the teacher, it supports the student's argument that he has lost his first case and therefore does not owe payment. If the court rules for the student, it supports the teacher's argument that the student has now won a case and must pay. The contradiction highlights a fundamental problem in how legal agreements depend on the outcomes of uncertain events. Consider how this paradox affects the idea of contracts and conditional agreements. A contract depends on clear terms that dictate what must happen in different situations. If a contract creates a loop where each possible outcome contradicts itself, then it raises questions about whether the contract is enforceable at all. In this case, the problem arises because the condition for payment depends on an event that itself is determined by whether payment is required. Legal systems try to avoid self-referential contradictions like this, but similar problems appear in real-world cases. Imagine a scenario where a company agrees to deliver a product only if a customer first provides a payment. The customer, in turn, agrees to make the payment only after receiving the product. If neither party is willing to act first, the contract collapses into a deadlock. This mirrors the dilemma between the teacher and the student, where each decision influences the conditions of the contract in a way that creates an unsolvable loop. The paradox of the court also highlights issues in legal reasoning about intent and obligation. If the student made the agreement in good faith, does he still have an obligation to pay, even if the conditions technically allow him to avoid it? If the teacher made the agreement knowing this contradiction could arise, is he acting in bad faith by suing? Legal systems often rely on intent and fairness when deciding contract disputes, but in this case, both sides could argue that fairness supports their position. Beyond law, this paradox raises broader philosophical questions about self-referential rules. Many paradoxes emerge when a rule applies to itself. Consider the liar paradox, where a statement says, "This sentence is false. If the sentence is true, then it must be false. If it is false, then it must be true." The paradox of the court follows a similar pattern because the lawsuit both fulfills and negates the terms of the agreement at the same time. This paradox also has implications for decision-making in uncertain situations. Many real-world decisions involve conditions that depend on their own outcomes. A business might only invest in a new project if it is profitable, but the project can only be profitable if the business invests in it. A job seeker might only move to a new city if they get a job there, but employers may only hire local candidates. These loops can prevent action unless an external force breaks the cycle. The paradox also connects to game theory, where participants make decisions based on how they expect others to act. In the teacher-student case, both parties assume they have the winning argument. The teacher believes he is guaranteed payment, while the student believes he is guaranteed not to pay. This mirrors real-world legal disputes where both sides believe their interpretation of the law is correct. Courts exist to resolve these disagreements, but in this case, any ruling reinforces both arguments rather than resolving them. In practical terms, this paradox illustrates why legal systems require clear and enforceable contracts. A well-written contract avoids ambiguity and self-referential conditions that can lead to paradoxes. In many cases, courts interpret contracts based on the intent of the agreement rather than just its literal wording. If the student and teacher had included a clause clarifying what happens in the event of a lawsuit, the paradox might have been avoided. Similar paradoxes appear in other fields as well. In mathematics, Gödel's incompleteness theorem shows that any sufficiently powerful system of logic contains statements that cannot be proven true or false within the system. In computing, self-referential loops can cause programs to crash or enter infinite cycles. In economics, certain pricing models create feedback loops where supply and demand continuously affect each other in unpredictable ways. The paradox of the court is a reminder that even simple agreements can lead to logical contradictions if they are not carefully structured. It also shows that some disputes cannot be resolved simply by applying rules, but require deeper reasoning about intent, fairness, and practicality. While legal systems aim to provide clear answers, paradoxes like this reveal the limitations of logic when applied to human agreements. This paradox continues to be discussed in philosophy, law, and logic because it highlights fundamental problems in reasoning about contracts and conditions. It remains an example of how even seemingly straightforward agreements can create contradictions when their terms depend on uncertain future events. A person sits in a barber's chair, completely hairless. The barber picks up the razor and runs it across their scalp and face. The question arises, has the person been shaved? If shaving means removing hair, and they had none to begin with, can we say they were shaved? This question seems simple, but it reveals a deeper paradox about language, categorization, and the way we define actions. This paradox builds on the Sorites paradox, which deals with vague terms like heap or bald. In the classic version, a single grain of sand is not a heap, and adding one grain at a time never seems to create a heap. But at some point, a heap clearly exists. The problem is deciding when the transition happens. The Sorites razor paradox follows the same logic. If someone is already bald, does the act of running a razor over their head count as shaving? If it does, then shaving does not necessarily require the removal of hair. If it does not, then someone could go through the full process of shaving and still not have been shaved. Imagine a man named John who has been bald since birth. Every morning, he follows a ritual. He wakes up, washes his face, and runs a razor over his scalp. He calls this shaving, just as someone with a full beard might call their routine shaving. But what exactly is John doing? If shaving means removing hair, then John is performing a meaningless action. If shaving means the act of passing a razor over the skin, then John is shaving even though no hair is involved. The problem is not in the action, but in how we define it. Consider a barber who offers free head shaves. A bald man walks in and asks for a shave. The barber could argue that there is nothing to shave and refuse service. But the bald man insists that a shave involves running a razor over the scalp, regardless of hair. If the barber completes this action, can he say he has shaved the customer? If he has, then the definition of shaving expands beyond removing hair. If he has not, then the action of running a razor over skin without hair does not count as shaving, even if it looks identical to a regular shave. This paradox challenges how we define actions and whether their meaning depends on their effect. Most people assume that actions are defined by their outcomes. Cutting something means making it shorter, lifting something means moving it upward, and shaving means removing hair. But what happens when an action is performed without achieving its usual outcome? If someone goes through the full motion of cutting a rope, but the blade is dull and does not cut, did they attempt to cut or did they fail to cut? The same question applies to shaving. If someone goes through the full process of shaving, but there is no hair to remove, have they shaved? A similar problem appears in cleaning. If someone wipes a spotless window with a cloth, have they cleaned it? If cleaning means removing dirt and there was no dirt, then they have not cleaned. If cleaning means performing the act of wiping a surface, then they have. The definition depends on whether the action is defined by the process or the result. Shaving faces the same issue. If it is defined by the process, then a bald man can be shaved. If it is defined by the result, then he cannot be. Another example appears in painting. Suppose a painter dips a brush in clear water and brushes it over a white canvas. Have they painted? If painting means applying a visible layer of pigment, then no. But if painting means applying a liquid with a brush, then yes. This highlights how everyday words often have two meanings, one tied to physical change and one tied to the process itself. This paradox also applies to exercise. If someone lifts an empty barbell, have they done weightlifting? If lifting weights means exerting effort to move a heavy object, then lifting an empty barbell may not count. But if weightlifting means performing the motion, then it does. The problem is whether the definition should focus on the difficulty of the action or simply the action itself. Shaving follows the same pattern. If it means removing hair, then a hairless person cannot be shaved. If it means using a razor on skin, then they can. This paradox also has legal and philosophical implications. If a law states that all prisoners must have their heads shaved, does that apply to bald prisoners? If the law assumes that shaving means removing hair, then the rule does not apply. But if shaving means running a razor over the head, then even a bald prisoner must go through the process. The meaning of the word determines whether the rule applies. The problem becomes clearer in automation. Suppose a robot is programmed to shave people. If it detects a human head, it automatically runs a razor over the skin. The robot does not check for hair, only for heads. If a bald person enters, the robot still completes the motion. Has the robot performed a shave? If we define shaving as an action rather than a result, then the robot has done its job. If we define shaving by its outcome, then it has done nothing. The paradox exposes how definitions shape our understanding of routine actions. The Sorites razor paradox also highlights an issue in artificial intelligence. AI systems operate based on predefined categories. If an AI barber is programmed to detect shaving as the act of running a razor over skin, it will consider a bald man to be shaved. If it is programmed to detect shaving as the removal of hair, then it will never register a shave on a bald person. This demonstrates how machines and humans can interpret actions differently based on definitions. Philosophers use this paradox to explore how language shapes reality. If a bald person goes to a barber, sits in a chair, and has a razor moved across their scalp, they may say they have been shaved. Someone else may argue that shaving must involve hair removal. Both views make sense, yet they contradict each other. The paradox forces people to reconsider whether actions should be defined by their physical steps or their intended effects. Everyday life is full of similar contradictions. If a chef stirs an empty pot, are they cooking? If a musician moves their fingers over silent piano keys, are they playing music? If a person opens a book but does not read it, have they read? These questions show how much meaning depends on expectation rather than strict logic. The Sorites razor paradox does not just challenge the definition of shaving, it reveals a deeper issue in language, logic, and categorization. Words seem precise, but their meaning shifts based on context. A bald man who runs a razor over his head might say he has shaved. Another person might say he has not. Both statements are valid, yet they contradict each other. This paradox is not just about hair. It is about how people understand and define the world around them. A lottery ticket has an extremely low chance of winning. The odds are so small that buying a ticket seems irrational. Mathematically, the expected return on investment is negative, meaning that over time, a person who buys tickets will almost certainly lose money. Yet millions of people still buy lottery tickets. This creates a paradox. If buying a ticket is irrational for one person, then it should be irrational for everyone. If everyone is acting irrationally, why does the lottery remain so popular? The paradox comes from the difference between logical decision-making and human psychology. A purely rational person would not buy a ticket because the cost outweighs the expected benefit. But people do not always make decisions based on pure logic. They weigh emotional factors, the thrill of risk, and the dream of winning against the actual probabilities. Many people view the lottery as entertainment rather than an investment. If someone spends a few dollars on a ticket, they may feel that the excitement and anticipation are worth the cost, even if they do not win. A simple example shows why the lottery is irrational from a mathematical standpoint. Imagine a game where you pay $2 for a chance to win $1 million. The catch is that the odds of winning are 1 in 300 million. To calculate the expected value of a ticket, multiply the prize by the probability of winning is approximately $0.00033. This means that, on average, a ticket is worth less than 1 cent, yet it costs $2. Over time, players will lose money. Despite this, people still play. The reason is that people do not think in terms of expected value when making decisions. Instead, they focus on the possibility of winning rather than the probability. Psychologists call this tendency the availability heuristic. People judge the likelihood of an event based on how easily they can recall similar events. When a lottery winner is announced, their story spreads quickly. News outlets report on their lives, their plans, and their reactions. The winner's story is memorable and easy to recall, but the millions of people who lost go unnoticed. Their stories are not told, so people do not think about them. This creates a distorted perception of the odds. Because people hear about winners more often than losers, they overestimate their chances of winning. Another reason people buy tickets is the effect of small probabilities on decision-making. People struggle to grasp extremely small odds. The difference between a 1 in 300 million chance and a 1 in 500 million chance feels insignificant, even though one is nearly twice as likely as the other. The human brain is not wired to process probabilities this small in a meaningful way. Instead of seeing the lottery as an impossibility, people see it as a small but real chance. The concept of loss aversion also plays a role. Loss aversion is the idea that people feel losses more strongly than equivalent gains. In the case of the lottery, a person may feel that missing a drawing means they have lost their chance at wealth. This feeling can be stronger than the logical understanding that playing makes almost no difference to their financial situation. If a person's coworkers or friends are buying tickets, they may feel pressure to participate. They do not want to be the one person who misses out if their group wins. This creates the illusion that buying a ticket is necessary, even though the odds remain the same whether they play or not. For some, the lottery represents hope. People in difficult financial situations may see it as their only chance to change their lives. They may feel stuck in low-paying jobs with no clear way to improve their situation. In this case, the lottery becomes more than a game. It becomes a symbol of possibility. The cost of a ticket is small compared to the potential reward. Even though the rational choice is to save money rather than spend it on tickets, the emotional appeal of a better future overrides logic. There is also the factor of near misses. If someone picks a set of numbers and most of them match, they feel like they almost won. Studies show that near misses trigger the same brain response as actual wins. This encourages continued play. If a person believes they were close to winning, they may feel that success is just around the corner, even though each drawing is independent and past results have no effect on future outcomes. Lottery organizers use specific strategies to increase participation. They structure the game in a way that maximizes excitement while keeping the odds low. Large jackpots attract more players, even though the odds remain the same. When a jackpot reaches record levels, more people buy tickets, which increases the jackpot even further. This creates a cycle where excitement builds, leading to even more ticket sales. The possibility of winning life-changing money overshadows the mathematical reality that most people will lose. Some people justify playing the lottery by comparing it to other forms of entertainment. A person might spend $10 on a movie ticket, knowing that they will not get any financial return. In the same way, they might spend a few dollars on a lottery ticket for the fun of imagining what they would do if they won. From this perspective, the lottery is not an investment, but a form of amusement. The problem is that many people play with the expectation of winning rather than for entertainment. This is why the lottery is often criticized as a tax on the poor. People who can least afford to lose money are the ones most likely to play. Even when people understand the odds, they still buy tickets. Part of the reason is that winning the lottery, however unlikely, is one of the few ways to become rich overnight. Most paths to wealth require years of work, saving, and investing. The lottery offers a shortcut. The appeal of immediate wealth is strong, even if the chance is nearly non-existent. The paradox remains. If buying a lottery ticket is irrational for one person, then it should be irrational for everyone. But because so many people buy tickets, jackpots grow to enormous amounts. This increased prize makes the game even more tempting, bringing in even more players. The cycle continues despite the fact that logic says no one should play. People justify buying tickets in different ways. Some see it as harmless fun, others view it as a small price to pay for the dream of a better life. The problem is that, over time, small purchases add up. A person who buys a $2 ticket every day will spend over $700 a year. Over a decade, that's more than $7,000, money that could have been saved or invested. Even with all these factors in mind, the fundamental paradox remains. No rational individual should buy a ticket, yet millions do. The answer lies in the gap between logical decision-making and human psychology. People do not always act based on expected value. They act based on emotion, perception, and the power of possibility. The lottery plays into these instincts, making it one of the most enduring forms of gambling, despite being one of the worst bets a person can make. Imagine someone tells you that you will win the lottery when you least expect it. This statement creates a logical problem. If you expect that you will win, then it contradicts the idea that it will happen when you least expect it. But if you expect that you will not win, then does that mean you should now expect to win? The paradox creates a cycle of reasoning where no consistent expectation makes sense. Think about a person who buys a lottery ticket every week. At first, they assume they will never win because the odds are so low. If they never expect to win, then the moment they do win, it aligns with the idea that the win was unexpected. But what if they start thinking about the paradox? If they accept that they will win when they least expect it, then they might start expecting it not to happen. But now, if they believe they won't win, doesn't that mean they should expect to win? The reasoning keeps folding back on itself. To see the contradiction more clearly, consider another version of the paradox that involves a surprise gift. Imagine a friend tells you that they will give you a surprise gift on a day when you least expect it. If you wake up every morning and think, today could be the day, then you always expect it. But if you convince yourself that the gift will never come, does that mean today is the day you should expect it? The paradox lies in how expectations interact with uncertainty. A similar problem appears in logic puzzles, like the unexpected hanging paradox. A judge tells a prisoner that he will be hanged on a weekday, but it will be a surprise. The prisoner thinks it through and concludes that he cannot be hanged on Friday, because if he is still alive by Thursday night, Friday would be the only day left, and that wouldn't be a surprise. Following the same reasoning, he eliminates Thursday, then Wednesday, and so on, until he concludes that he will never be hanged. But when the executioner arrives on a random day, the prisoner is still surprised. The logic collapses when reality steps in. Now apply the same idea to the lottery paradox. A person believes they will only win when they don't expect it. But if they use logic to argue that they can never expect it, then they always expect not to win. If expecting not to win is the condition that leads to winning, then should they now expect to win? The reasoning flips back and forth without reaching a stable conclusion. Another way to see the problem is to look at how probability works. The chance of winning the lottery is incredibly low. People generally assume they will lose because mathematically, losing is the overwhelming outcome. But just because they expect to lose doesn't change the odds. Each ticket still has the same probability of winning, no matter what someone believes. The paradox plays on how people confuse expectation with actual probability. Even if someone fully expects to lose, their expectation doesn't affect the random nature of the lottery draw. Psychology also plays a role in the paradox. People are bad at handling uncertainty. When faced with an event that could happen at any time, they try to create mental shortcuts to predict it. But the very idea of least expecting something creates a loop. If someone truly doesn't expect an event, then they wouldn't even be thinking about it. But if they try to prepare for it by expecting not to expect it, they're caught in a contradiction. A real-world example of this paradox occurs with surprise bonuses at work. An employer tells employees they will receive a surprise bonus when they least expect it. At first, the employees go about their work without expecting anything. Then someone realizes that if they least expect it, maybe that means they should start expecting it to happen soon. But once they start expecting it, it can no longer be a surprise. So now they convince themselves that it won't happen, which makes them believe it actually might happen. The cycle continues, and the bonus, whenever it comes, still surprises them. This paradox also connects to the idea of self-fulfilling and self-defeating prophecies. A self-fulfilling prophecy occurs when believing something makes it come true, like someone who expects to fail a test and then performs poorly because of their mindset. A self-defeating prophecy is the opposite. If someone believes that saying a wish out loud stops it from coming true, then they will never express their deepest wishes. The lottery paradox is closer to a self-defeating prophecy. If someone convinces themselves that expecting to lose will make them win, they start expecting to win, which then should prevent them from winning under the original logic. The paradox stops them from forming a stable belief. A similar contradiction appears in competitive games. A chess player might expect their opponent to make a particular move, but if the opponent realizes this, they might change their strategy to remain unpredictable. Now, if the original player anticipates this change, they must adjust again. The cycle of expecting and counter-expecting continues. The more someone tries to predict an unpredictable event, the more they interfere with their own reasoning. One way to escape the paradox is to stop trying to apply logic to an inherently random event. The lottery has no memory. The balls do not know who expects to win or lose. No amount of logical reasoning changes the fundamental randomness of the draw. If someone wins, it is because their number was drawn, not because of their expectations. But the paradox isn't about the actual lottery. It is about the nature of expectations and how they contradict themselves when turned into conditions for an event. Another way to resolve the paradox is to define what it means to least expect something. If someone plays the lottery for 20 years and wins once, that win is still unexpected relative to the number of times they lost. A person might least expect to win on a particular Tuesday, even though they generally expect to lose over time. The paradox works by forcing a false choice between expecting and not expecting when real expectations exist on a spectrum. If someone wants to play with the paradox, they could try to create the perfect state of mind where they neither expect to win nor expect to lose. But the moment they think about whether they have reached that mindset, they have failed. True surprise cannot be planned. The paradox of the unexpected lottery plays with this fact, making it impossible to fully resolve in a way that satisfies both logic and intuition.